the self that is there is a momentary and dependent self. And it's just a concept. It's a practical concept. And it is reflected in the story we have about ourselves. That which in psychology, modern psychology is called the self-narrative. Even the Buddha had a self-narrative. He narrated his story, he told his story time and again about he grew up and was very appalled by the sights of old people and sick people and the realization that people die. It was very developed a sensitivity towards these basic facts of life. And when he was 29 years old, he left his home the very night his wife gave birth to his son. And he didn't even wake his wife up. He just took one look at her and at the boy, and he told the servant, called him Rahula. It means chain. Call him chain. And then he left. He felt samvega and a huge sense of spiritual necessity. So he walked out the road. And the reason why, just the sight of his first child arose this samvega in him. It's actually very it's very common for first-time parents to sort of also feel a little bit in all the happiness and the joy, a depression, and you become very aware of your mortality, Now this is, and some actually get a depression, and some men who get a depression, they just leave, And they're not so successful as Siddhartha Gautama was. We walked out the road and looking for that which is not subjected to old age, disease and death. Looking for the deathless. And that he found. And then he returned to his wife and established her in the realization of the deathless, and established his son in the realization of the deathless. That's actually not part of the story he himself tells. It's other people tell the story about him. What his narrative is, this is a story he himself tells in many discourses, again and again. It's about his childhood, his sight, the thoughts, his reflections on old age, disease and death, and the fact that he did leave his home and that he wandered about and he spent some years practicing asceticism and left that completely disgusted, practiced some sort of spiritual eating disorder, fasting for years. Maybe because he had grown up in a well-to-do family. In his self-narrative, the Buddha talks about that his father had 3 houses, one for each of the North Indian seasons, and everything was happiness in his childhood, except his awareness of old age, disease, and death. And so he left when he was 29 years old, and wandered about, spent some time with some ascetics, left them and met up with some yogis and learned samatha meditation from these yogis. And learned all the 8 jhanas, which the yogis thought to be the immortal, unchanging soul, but because of the mental purity of the pre-Buddha, he became disillusioned with these jhanas, which are only very expanded states of consciousness in the stream of consciousness. They're not unchanging, they are streaming. And this he detected. And then he became disillusioned, nibbida. And that gave rise to viraga, letting go. And that gave gave rise to a momentary liberation. So he turned away from these jhanas and the belief in that they were the path to enlightenment. And then he has this wonderful story about he approaches Bodh Gaya, where Joseph and I lived for many years, 6 years, Munindra-ji. And he talks about the river that is still there, and the dragon blood river. And then he saw this beautiful tree. And then he thought, I'll sit down just right there. For a young man who is determined on putting forth effort, this is the right place. And I'll sit down and I won't rise before I have it. My aspiration, my spiritual aspiration has been fulfilled. And that was on the eve of enlightenment. And in the night of enlightenment, the Buddha discovered the Four Noble Truths, realized them intuitively. The first Noble Truth of suffering as a condition of all existence. Second Noble Truth as the desire, thirst, tanha as a cause of suffering. The third Noble Truth as the overcoming of the elimination of the cause of suffering through disillusioning with what is impermanent. When you become disillusioned, you let go and you become liberated. This sequence has both a relative aspect and an absolute aspect to it. The relative aspect is, of course, the one we're practicing. Every time you see a nature, you let go. You're liberated for that moment, and all these insights accumulate. They sort of and converge into the maturity of the 37 factors of enlightenment, as it did in the case of Siddhartha Gautama, and then you go through the absolute disillusionment with all. It's like the maturity of your insight encompasses really everything, even your consciousness. So the mind let go of even consciousness. And the transcendental aspect of the vimutti, of the liberation, cannot be understood in terms of the concepts, cannot be understood in terms of the experience of the impermanent. Like all concepts, we use they are conditioned by the impermanent experience, and this does not pertain to the transcendental of the perceptual process of consciousness, of the stream of consciousness. But this is the final uprooting of the cause of suffering, of this tanha. It is eliminated with a force as of a lightning bolt, it is said. The fourth noble truths are understood in one insight at the moment of enlightenment. So there's both this theoretical, conceptual level of understanding of the Four Noble Truths, then there's a relative, intuitive aspect, and then there's this absolute aspect. And they are like stepping stones leading on to each other. But even the enlightened one has this self-narrative, this story about himself. And of course it's a very purified story. It is a story that reflects the wisdom of enlightenment. A boy grows up and understands the misery of impermanence as he sees old people, people who become sick, and people who die. And it's a story about a young man who walks out to find the deathless, to find that which is not subjected to this. And it's about that young man who finds it. He was 35 years old. He was, of course, not a young man, a mature man at that age. So that's a wonderful story. And each one of us are developing, refining our self-narrative in our insight meditation. As your concentration deepens, memories, layers of your consciousness you are usually out of contact with, surface for you to develop insight into, both on the biographical level, but also on the existential. It's rather, as I said, we develop the existential insights primarily in the context of our life history. Primarily. You can, of course, develop insight in listening to the birds, but the real momentum of your insight you develop in this deep introspection and retrospection of your mental continuity. And what basically happens in this process, many things happen. One thing, emotional memories that are very hard to, it's as if you re-experience all the bad things you experienced when these memories were sort of encoded into your long-term memory. All these emotional memories, they are transformed into cognitive memories, no longer. I'll give you an example of this, like 2 years ago I had this quarrel with a good friend and it made me very sad. And when I think about it, I get sad again. I think about, oh, that was awful. And I re-experience all the negative emotions that was in that situation. Okay, so then I meditate and then I understand the conditions of this situation. I understand the no-self, the anicca, dukkha, anatta, and dependencies of this memory, and I de-identify from it, and it doesn't disappear because I understand it. I sort of distillate some wisdom out of it in my understanding. And when I think of it now, I can recall easily what happened then. And I can recall it made me very sad, but I don't become sad now. I'm equanimous. So this happens to our most difficult memories. It's just one aspect of psychological liberation. And the overall perspective, we develop a more and more consistent life story about ourselves, more and more coherent and consistent, and that reflects our insights, the wisdom we're developing in the retrospection of this life story. Just as in the case with Siddhartha Gautama. The Buddha often used the conventional concept of the self. You should take a refuge in yourself without having any other refuge. Now, how are you doing this? By practicing the foundation of mindfulness. And on other occasions he says that the enlightened, the arahant, the enlightened monk has developed his self by understanding no self. Basically, the enlightened one becomes the Dharma. He becomes the stream of consciousness, this purified stream of consciousness, undiluted by desires or unwholesome states of mind.